Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss the four freedoms and the themes of American exceptionalism as they played out in World War II. Before we begin, here are some questions to keep in mind as you watch this flipped lecture. What American ideals do the four freedoms reflect? Why would Franklin D. Roosevelt give this speech before the United States was involved in World War II? And how do Roosevelt's four freedoms reflect the idea of American exceptionalism? Before we begin talking about World War II, let's review what is meant by American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States is exceptional, is set apart and unique when compared to other nations in the world and indeed other nations in history. And this belief can involve the idea that the United States is the greatest nation in the world. And it can also involve the belief that the United States has a mission to spread its ideals, to spread Americanism across the world. And American exceptionalism says that the United States' economic system of capitalism and free enterprise has led to unprecedented prosperity and freedom in terms of business, technology, and other things that make up the economy. Socially, the United States is said to be characterized by social mobility, as well as social activism among its people and the idea of equality. And all of these ideas are considered to be a part of the American way of life. And politically, the United States is a democracy, more accurately a democratic republic, but the idea of republicanism and the unique United States form of government is another reason that people will say that America is exceptional. Now that we have reviewed what American exceptionalism means, let's get into how this theme played out in the Second World War. Just a brief review of the world in January of 1941. At this point, the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, were handily winning World War II. Nazi Germany had won victories in East and Northern Europe, in Poland, and into the Soviet Union. They had won victory over France, and the Battle of Britain was underway. In Fascist Italy, they had conquered most of North Africa, and with Nazi help were holding onto that territory, and Imperial Japan had invaded China and had control over much of Southeast Asia, including Korea, Manchuria, and Indochina, what today is known as Vietnam. So this is the world map of that the United States was looking at in 1941. Everything in black is controlled by the Axis powers, everything in blue are the Allies, the red is the Soviet Union, and everything else is neutral. So as you can see, the Axis powers clearly had the upper hand in World War II. In the United States in January of 1941 was isolationist. After the First World War, many Americans believed that involvement in European wars were mistakes. And so the domestic issues of the time, of the 1930s, such as the Great Depression and the New Deal, are going to largely dominate American politics. And most Americans support the idea of isolationism. As a result, neutrality acts are going to be passed to basically ban situations such as the shipping of war materials that could bring the United States into the war. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the United States also wanted to be prepared, and so they adopted a policy of preparedness in which the United States began draft registration and began increasing the size of its Army and Navy. But all of this is in the context that the United States has not entered the war. But the president at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he diverted from traditional isolationism, believing instead in an idea called internationalism. And internationalism is just what it sounds like. It's the idea that the United States should be involved in the affairs of the world. And beliefs of internationalists are that international trade helps prevent wars by encouraging prosperity, and that it is the role of the United States to be involved in preserving peace worldwide. And so because of this, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted the U.S. to be involved in the world affairs of the 1930s into 1940s. But the majority of Americans still supported neutrality and isolationism. So as a result, Franklin Roosevelt kept and enforced these neutral policies. But the United States and its leader, Franklin Roosevelt, were far from neutral. The country was largely sympathetic to the Allies, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself made a distinction between aggressors, in this case he said the Axis powers, and the victims in the war, which were the other European nations. So he began to push for provisions that allowed the United States to sell arms to the Allies. These would become known as the Lend-Lease Act, as well as the idea of cash and carry. And finally, the United States is going to put an oil embargo on Japan, which is going to also try to assist the Allies. And all of this as well is the idea that the United States, as a democratic republic, is opposed to the political idea of fascism, and has more in common with Great Britain, which was a democracy as well. So in January of 1941, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, gave his State of the Union address to talk about the Axis powers as a threat to United States national security, as well as to remind them of the ideals of democracy. And the State of the Union address outlined the need for the United States to provide aid to the Allied powers. And ultimately this speech becomes known as the Four Freedoms speech because Franklin Roosevelt proposed an idea that all people in the world should have 4 freedoms. And Roosevelt opened his speech and then came to the part about the 4 freedoms. And he said, "In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms." And the 4 freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Roosevelt first said that the first freedom is freedom of speech, and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. So what do we take away from this speech? Is this a call to spread the ideals of the United States to the world? Does this speech show a belief in the supremacy of American institution values? And does it invoke the mission to promote liberty and liberal democracy? Is this an example of America as a shining city upon a hill? And does this speech invoke the mission of American exceptionalism to spread these ideals? Let's also consider how this might be problematic. At this time in 1941, were any groups denied freedoms inside of the United States? And then ultimately, what role in the world does the United States suggest it is taking on by giving this speech? To just kind of connect this to another idea, American exceptionalism has often been tied up in the wars that the United States fights. In World War I, President Woodrow Wilson created a cause for the United States to fight for. The idea was to make the world safe for democracy, and he outlined that more specifically in his 14 points. Franklin Delano Roosevelt does largely the same thing, where the cause for World War II becomes not only the defense of the United States, but to spread the 4 freedoms across the world. And this also sets the United States on the course of internationalism, and this is the course the United States will follow into the Cold War. American exceptionalism at this time also takes on a big role in United States culture. From the creation of Captain America, and yes, that is a picture of him punching Adolf Hitler on the front of that comic book, to the way that the war, World War II, is going to be portrayed in films, such as The Longest Day with John Wayne, and ultimately into the Cold War, the idea of American ideals coming up against Soviet ideals in the film Rocky IV. So as you can see, this idea has far-reaching consequences. And ultimately the impact of these 4 freedoms is going to be that World War II is going to be known as the Good War. And a grand narrative is going to be written that is going to suggest that the United States kind of with the forces of right and justice behind them, came into World War II in order to save the world for democracy and free oppressed people. The United Nations is also going to include, once it is formed after the Second World War, a Declaration of Human Rights that is going to be largely based upon the four freedoms that Roosevelt suggested before the U.S. entered World War II. And then ultimately, the United States intervention during the Cold War is going to be impacted by the four freedoms. And the development of the Truman Doctrine, which was the U.S. pledge to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation around the world. So the four freedoms are going to have a large impact, both on the United States before they enter World War II, as well as after the war is finished. So now that we've looked at these four freedoms, and what the president proposed in 1941, now we can go back and we can look at some of those questions and see what we can figure out about American exceptionalism and the Second World War.